I'm Kurt Wagner.
And I'm Mike Epley.
We're old college debate teammates who disagree about pretty much everything as often as possible.
In each episode, we examine a question inspired by the week's events.
Despite our disagreements, we're friends. We respect each other, we keep each other honest, and we have fun doing it.
And most importantly, we drink.
Offering a fresh, informed snapshot of the debates that dominate contemporary discourse, this is Right Brain, Left Brain.
Here we go. You ready to party?
No, I hate fun.
Okay.
As I've said before.
Too bad. Time's up.
Welcome to Right Brain, Left Brain, the champagne of podcasts.
Real podcast for our sham friends. Pain for our podcast friends. God, it was so good when you said that. Had you been waiting to say that when you busted that out a couple episodes ago?
I don't remember. I was very drunk.
It was really good.
Anyways, this episode of Right Brain, Left Brain is brought to you by way of The Kraken.
The Kraken.
Black spiced rum.
We've already had a little.
Yes, as you can tell.
And by way of Budweiser, the king of beers.
All hail the king.
And then I'll give you one guess what old Right Brain Kurt's got over there. Yep, 21st Amendment, blah, 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 IPA.
And, of course, our friend, the other regent of liver disease, Crown Royal.
Crown Royal. Oh, shit, you're right. We've got the king of beers and Crown Royal. This is getting awkward.
That's why we're called the emperor of liver disorders.
Well, cheers.
Cheers.
Hey, thank you to our loyal listeners. Thank you for listening. Thanks for telling your friends about us, as always.
Thank you so much to our subscribers on Patreon. You have helped underwrite the cost of our drinking and helped make this show even better. So go ahead and check out this month's Patreon episode. It's now live at patreon.com/RBLBpod.
You're going to love it.
Yes, it is an analysis on Trump's border wall and the government shutdown. And we have a take that you're not going to catch anywhere else. That's why you love our show. So go check it out on Patreon. It's fucking awesome.
Yep. So why don't we dive into this week's episode? What's going on out there in the world?
Well, a Clinton staffer tried to sabotage Bernie Sanders by disclosing that he'd used a private jet extensively in 2016. They knew this and were able to disclose this because the private flights were provided by the Hillary campaign so that Bernie could travel around and stump for her and give speeches in her favor in the hopes that she'd beat Donald Trump.
Fucking Hillary bros, man. Can't keep them off of Twitter.
Yeah.
Always a new back to stab on the political left.
And each back is always on Bernie.
A lot of square footage. Hey, speaking of Bernie's launch to his presidential campaign that just came out a couple weeks ago has now raised massively more money than anyone else in the Democratic Party and faster. It's been like a week and they're already at $10 million and counting. And if that seems like it's a lot, it is about how much money Jeff Bezos makes each time he takes a dump.
Yeah, and he wipes his ass with a $10,000 bill.
Which they print just for him.
And if you think that I won't lick a shit-covered $10,000 bill just to keep the bill, well, you're fucking wrong.
God, would you, our listeners, weigh in on Twitter?
All the honest people on Twitter, come on and tell us the truth, which is that you would. And all the liars who are grandstanding because you know that there's nothing to gain by admitting you would eat this poop.
More power to you.
More power to you. Green Book won Best Picture at the Oscars in what must have been the slowest year for movies in all of film history.
Also, ex-Trump lawyer, famous fixer, and one-time guarantor of porn star silence, Michael Cohen, testified before Congress this week, throwing Trump under the bus about his shady tax dealings. But my personal favorite part of the Cohen testimony that I've seen was Cohen saying that Trump told him to threaten his high schools and colleges to never release his grades or SAT scores or else.
And if you're on the right, you're laughing at this because you realize that a lot of this is unprovable or stuff that's already new.
For this one, he actually brought a hard copy of a letter.
Oh, did he?
Yeah. But Obama didn't release that shit either. So
yeah, we're recording.
And Trump was big about criticizing Obama in 2012 about it. That's how I was looking
What, his
it
SAT
up.
scores?
Yeah. During the Obama campaign in 2012, when Trump was all on this birtherism thing, he was calling for Obama to release his transcripts and his applications because he thought that in his applications it said that he talked about being born in Kenya. So that shit was never released either because obviously all colleges and high schools are legally bound to keep all of those records.
So what did Cohen's letter say?
Cohen's letter basically was like, hey, you better not release this shit if this shit gets out.
It was from Trump?
Yeah, it was like on behalf of Trump, right? It was like on behalf of...
Oh, so it was a letter that Cohen wrote.
It was a letter that
Cohen claimed that Trump had dictated to him.
Yeah.
So it's something that once again will satisfy people who want to hear that they've got the goods on Trump, but everybody else will look at it and be like, all you've proven is that Michael Cohen wrote a letter.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, no, he probably did that shit on the weekend just for fun.
Well, if he's like you and me in our college debate days, no matter how many days in advance he had to prepare for it, he probably wrote it on his way in to the actual presentation. So, worth noting that Univision correspondent Jorge Ramos was detained in Venezuela after he asked a couple pretty good questions in an interview with President Nicolas Maduro.
I heard that once Trump found out that Maduro had detained Ramos, that was days ago, and Trump still has not emerged from the bathroom because he still can't figure out what to tweet about it. And speaking of Venezuela, what are we talking about this week?
As it turns out, we're talking about Venezuela.
So Venezuela is an oil-rich country in the northern region of South America.
In 1999, Venezuelans elected the now famous Hugo Chavez, who served as president until his death in 2013.
During that time, Chavez famously nationalized a bunch of industries, including, most famously, the oil industry.
Because Venezuela is one of the top oil-producing countries in the world, and because the global oil market was in a major boom throughout his presidency, the country raked in the dough by the trillions.
Yeah, Chavez funneled tons of that money into social programs designed to help the poor and raise the quality of life for the average Venezuelan. From the time he took office to the time he croaked, Venezuela's unemployment rate was cut in half, income per capita more than doubled, the poverty rate fell by more than half, education improved, as well as infant mortality rates declining.
When Chavez died at 58 of cancer, the next in line of succession was his handpicked successor, Chavez's vice president, Nicolas Maduro. And Maduro narrowly won an election 6 weeks later, despite being handpicked by Chavez.
But not good for Maduro. By 2014, global oil prices fell precipitously. The cost of a barrel of crude went from $110 to under $50 in just a few months' time.
Because Venezuela is economically, what's the opposite of diverse?
I think it's just
versed.
Because Venezuela pretty much only depends on oil exports.
This led to a pretty immediate recession and then a depression. And over the last couple of years, it's been reported that the average adult Venezuelan has lost 19 pounds. And it's getting worse because it's at the point now that the country is in full economic collapse. They have the world's highest inflation, which means that the cost of everything is going up more and more and more and more, and that the wages you get paid are worth less and less and less every day. There's widespread malnutrition. And one of the things that the Chavismo government sort of touted as one of its benefits of Chavismo socialism was the eradication of malaria. And yet now it's making a huge comeback as the supplies of medicine and availability of nutrition have dwindled to basically nothing.
Yep, the skeeters are back. And now Venezuela is without food, without basic medical supplies. Millions have fled the country, and those that have not fled are pretty pissed. Maduro's approval rating has been below 20% for a couple of years now, and protests have been getting bigger and louder.
That's led Maduro to take increasingly authoritarian actions to stifle these protests.
Yeah, he's been arresting, killing, limiting free speech, limiting assembly, taking anti-election actions like blocking recall referenda, which is particularly damning since back in 2004, Hugo Chavez famously allowed a national referendum on a recall, and he defeated the effort with about a 58% margin at the polls.
Maduro even stacked the Supreme Court so full of loyalists that they voted to remove power from the legislative branch of the country. Sound familiar? I may have heard this story before, only to reverse that decision in the face of massive protests.
Maduro did win an election at the end of last year, though the international community are pretty agreed that it was a rigged election.
And in response, opposition leader Juan Guaido has declared himself interim president, citing the Venezuelan constitution's rules about the secession of power in the event the democratic process breaks down.
He is calling for Maduro to step down, and then once Maduro is out, Guaido wants there to be a free and fair election.
An increasing number of countries are recognizing Guaido as the president.
Some countries have offered to send food aid, notably the United States. But Maduro has blocked the aid from entering the country, saying that it is just a political ploy to bolster support for Guaido. Basically, it's an invasion by food truck. It's been called a Trojan horse.
In recent days, days, Guaido met with Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, to discuss options. They even discussed the option of a military intervention, reportedly, which the United States has said is not off the table. Mike Pence even supposedly accidentally wrote down on a notepad at a meeting 10,000 troops to Colombia.
So while the story in Venezuela is interesting and compelling, it is certainly not unique. There are countries around the globe dealing with power struggles, economic trials, massive protests, sometimes at scales that make the situation in Venezuela seem even insignificant, like Democratic Republic of the Congo, tens of millions of Syrian refugees.
Another supposedly wonderful democratic republic, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, aka North Korea.
That's probably a big one. Yet somehow all of the major news outlets in the U.S. and even the president and Bernie Sanders are talking about Venezuela.
So how do people feel about this? People on the right say Venezuelan socialism failed because of the inherent failures of socialism, and that the United States should take a strong stand against it.
And people on the left are kind of conflicted on this one. The center left is with the neocons, who are all about bringing Venezuela into the fold, even if it means funding a coup or applying some sanctions. The farther left, or really just Democratic Socialist Bernie Sanders, doesn't seem to want to all out condemn the socialist regime for somewhat obvious reasons that, of course, I'll be talking more about later. But that really brings us to the question for this week's episode. Why is everybody talking about Venezuela?
Well, on the right, we say that it's because Maduro is a communist dictator who the United States should do everything short of hardcore boots on the ground invasion to remove from power.
On the left, I say that the United States gives a fuck about Venezuela for two primary reasons. Number one being Russia, and number two, to use it as a whipping boy against the socialism boogeyman. And it also doesn't hurt that Venezuela has oil. So we probably disagree. Think we should probably drink and then argue.
I'm inclined to agree with your analysis.
All right, party time.
To whipping the socialist boogeyman.
You know what? I'll cheers to that because I'm interpreting it differently. All right, sucker. Let's hear it. Why is everybody talking about Venezuela?
Well, Venezuela's problems are an excellent highlight of the failure of socialism and something that requires American action. Socialism brought on this collapse. Chavismo nationalized multiple industries, and then they drove up inflation with unsustainable spending and eventually borrowing, defaulting, and then printing more currency. Essentially, right, like they drove out their own internal production mechanisms with their socialist policies. Before Chavismo, Venezuela was able to sustain itself with a mixture of internal production and imports. And then the state-owned companies that Chavismo used would use a number of state revenues to sell products at prices so low that private sellers couldn't compete. And then that's why private sellers of food and medicine disappeared from the Venezuelan marketplace. And for a while that worked because they had so much money from oil revenue that had been distributed around the economy that they could just switch over to an import-based economy. And that worked really great until, the price of a barrel of oil plummeted. Then that created a problem of starvation and lack of medical supplies because even after that point, the state-run companies didn't have the resources to actually make those products, right? So that's why there's bread lines all over Venezuela. That's why people are waiting in line for hours to be the first person to pay $50 for one package of ramen, which only the first 5 out of 500 people can even pay for. This all highlights the unsustainability of socialism. It's worth noting, too, that the socialist sort of slide in the economy is what precipitated the end of the democratic processes, first under Chavismo in Chavez and then under his successor in Maduro, right? Just like socialism in Germany, Venezuelan socialism started out as a true democracy. Chavez was very popular in the beginning when his system was in the phase of temporarily delivering services and programs it would later make unsustainable. The worse that the economic effects lowered his quality of life, the less popular that his government became. Chavez had made himself president for life, and that's around the time that Chavez was jailing, harassing, and exiling his political opponents. In a way, you could say that he had engaged in democratic socialism more than anybody else, but it still ended in this murdering, thugging, totalitarian regime because that's what it does. It slows down the economy, and then once you've lost control of the economy to keep you popular, then you have to become repressive and brutal. Because Chavez had done so much to make himself popular in his lifetime, he was able to sustain that up until his death, but then Maduro came in and he had none of that residual goodwill, so the people couldn't pretend that the economy was good anymore, and there was no reason for them to support Maduro. And so instantly you see that when you switch out that cult of personality around the leader, the same policies already trigger instant dissatisfaction. Things have only gotten worse since then. International election monitors already agree Venezuela was less free to not really free under Chavez and is certainly not a free country now. And it's worth noting that any country that won't let their people receive food and medicine when their people are starving and dying of disease is a true dictatorship. The Maduro regime gunned down Venezuelans trying to receive aid from the Colombian and Brazilian borders this week. And this is why the United States should do everything up to actually actual invasion to restore order. The United States has a mandate to be involved in any humanitarian issue in the Americas. Even when they don't have oil, we have much more of a reputation for getting involved in any humanitarian issues, especially in the America. And this repeated fallacious insinuation of oil being the necessary thing is like a distraction from the legitimacy of what we're doing. And even if we were invading for the oil, we owe it to the world to keep critical resources out of the hands of people who are going to use it against democracy and use that oil wealth and the power the oil brings them to starve, brutalize, and murder their people. This is one of the worst humanitarian crises in North or South America in decades. It's not the United States that's making this happen. We're one of dozens of nations who recognize Guaido as Venezuelan president. All of Venezuela's neighbors are with us on this. They don't want some sort of humanitarian migrant crisis triggered by destabilization or a belligerent communist dictator right on their border, especially one that's powered with oil wealth and has an aggressive, powerful, expansive military. The whole world has agreed. Maduro's got to go. Chavismo's got to go. Democracy has to return to Venezuela.
Well, time to drink.
I agree.
Cheers. All right. Okay. Well, that all sounds fine, except that it's not all fine. And here's how it's not. So I got my own answer to the question, why is everybody in the United States talking about Venezuela? The United States gives a fuck about Venezuela for two main reasons. The less important reason is Russia. It's one of the main reasons that the U.S. has given a fuck, as Kurt mentions, about other countries in the Americas throughout history since the formation of the Soviet Union. Venezuela has been under the Russian umbrella of influence for many years. They're closely aligned with Cuba. The U.S. does not like that. Think the U.S. involvement in Cuba. Think the Bay of Pigs. Also think about Syria. It's not just an America's thing. When it comes to the U.S. wanting to undermine Russian influence, they'll do it anywhere in the world.
And I actually agree that there's a point to that. Yeah.
Right. These are extensions of the Cold War. It's not the Cold War anymore. Now it's just a proxy war. I don't need to go into a ton of detail there because like Kurt said, he doesn't really disagree on this. It's just an important note that I think matters more to the U.S. calculation about why we're talking about or considering Venezuela than anyone in the media or anyone in the government is willing to ever admit.
A Cold War by any other name would smell just as sweet, and the arms sales just as profitable.
But I think a much more important reason that Venezuela is on every news channel on TV is because it is being used as a whipping boy against the socialism boogeyman for the purpose of the upcoming 2020 election.
Ooh.
Both the Donald and poor Fox News watching Kurt argue that Venezuela is somehow proof that socialism doesn't work. Never mind that Norway is a socialist country whose chief export is also oil and also happens to rank among the highest globally in happiness, health, wealth, income equality, economic stability, education, and democracy. Yes, it is not a socialism problem. It is just an economics problem. This binary thinking of free market, zero government capitalism versus total communism, zero freedom, state everything is just a garbage binary that's not actually up for debate because it's not happening almost anywhere. The places where either one of those extremes are happening, those are states that are in a perpetual state of failure. There are countries that do capitalism and socialism, like, I don't know, just off the top of my head, the United States, that are still kicking. Boo. And if you ask most Americans, we can do with another spoonful or two of socialist policy. Never forget that Medicare is a socialist policy. Never forget that Never forget that Social Security is a socialist policy. Never forget that most of the major highways in this country were built under the New Deal, which was a socialist policy. And never forget that they're all massively popular among libtards, conservative pricks, moderates, because I couldn't think of a pun for the word moderates, independents, Freemasons, and Illuminati alike. As long as Norway is A, socialist, B, an oil exporter, and C, thriving, the hypothesis that Venezuela failed because socialism is disproved. If anything, it is just socialism done poorly, which I actually am happy to agree to. I really don't understand this fear of the socialism word, though. It seems like a foregone conclusion that it is a bad word, but A, tons of countries do socialism to varying degrees, and B, the U.S. already does it to a significant degree, so why spend time maligning redistribution of national wealth unless you've been conditioned by those who wish to concentrate wealth to do so? Well, I guess the answer is kind of in the question. And by the way, it doesn't hurt that Venezuela has oil when it comes to the U.S. being interested. The U.S. is like a moth, and Venezuelan heavy crude is a front porch light. Also, Maduro should go. He is a dictator and a worse one than Chavez, but the United States should stay the fuck out of it. We have intervened in Latin America enough. Remember Allende? Remember the Bay of Pigs? That shit ain't cute anymore. Plus, Donald Trump is a massive hypocrite. If he gives a single solitary fuck about the people in any Latin American country, I'll eat my hat. Also, as if Donald Trump cares about dictatorships. Kim Jong-un is his fucking little buddy, while the average height of a North Korean...
A communist dictator, by the way.
And a communist dictator, while the average height of a North Korean is inches shorter than a South Korean due to the systematic starvation of the North Korean people over the last several decades. Beware trusting that our president has a moral compass. He does not. I don't think Kurt's even going to contest that. Furthermore, weaponizing foreign aid as a methodology for regime change is monstrous. All of this food aid that's sitting outside of the Venezuelan border could go into Venezuela. It could be distributed through the Maduro regime, for example. If we gave a fuck about stopping people from dying in Venezuela, we could work with the Maduro regime to distribute food aid to keep people alive. If that was actually a priority, it is not our priority. Also, potentially, we could not be currently embargoing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Venezuelan oil that the U.S. has been the chief purchaser of in the past. Starving people through sanctions is not humanitarian. So fuck your food aid. Fuck your talking about how you give a shit about the Venezuelan people if this is a political thing about socialism or something to stop the red curtain. And I guess that's all I have to say about that. You want a drink?
No. I've once again discovered that I hate fun as a result of hearing your terrible speech.
You love my speech. I've turned you into a leftist revolutionary.
No, but I will drink. This is the most important reason why I take contention with what you're saying, is because when we talk about the issue of people starving, people going through the trash for food, right? Like, we're talking about the endless repetition of the socialist scheme that is perpetuated by you guys abusing the definition of socialism and mitigating the failures that are the results of the inherent failure of the program, and taking anything that works because of capitalism and because of, at best, hybrid systems, but in reality just capitalist systems that have generous welfare programs, and then calling those things socialist when they're not. Like, if you want to call the systems of Norway, Sweden, and other Western European countries like socialist, then socialism doesn't sound as bad, right? But those are really just capitalist systems.
It's not always bad.
Those are just capitalist systems with generous welfare
Well, can
states.
you loosely define socialism for me?
Socialism is seriously, like, if you want to stick to the Marxist definition, which, you know, Chavez and Maduro would cite, is the seizure of the means of production and then giving that to the people. And then, as Marx would detail socialism, right, he would talk about how eventually you still have some facets of capitalism in this, but eventually you're transitioning into what he calls hard communism. You know what I mean?
So when you say that, are you saying that only if it's full on communism does it qualify as socialism?
Well, what I'm saying is that systems like Norway
Right.
have not seized the means of production.
So even though they call themselves socialist, you don't call them socialist.
Well, there's the reason why that people in those countries call those things quote unquote democratic socialist, small d, right? Because
they're still democracies.
They're admitting that state control of everything is much less than you would see in a country like Venezuela or Cuba. Norway is a free market. Still, even though they're like, they like to flirt with the label of socialism, because socialism is just a brand, right?
They're not a free telecommunications market or a free oil market or a free energy market.
I mean, they still have a lot of like private like enterprise.
Well, there's tons of like stores, right? There's tons of industry there, no question.
Right, but
that's true in Venezuela as well.
Right, but Venezuela and Cuba like seized control of food production.
What is your threshold? Because you're right that a lot of these countries have seized a different number or different versions of key sectors of the marketplace. But what is the threshold for calling it full-on socialism, right? Even Venezuela is not full-on like North Korea style communism. But even you still go to a market and use currency to purchase food from someone else who's selling that food, or to purchase shoes or clothes, right? That's still a marketplace in Venezuela. So is Venezuela full-on socialism then? or not? And also, why does it have to be a binary?
Well, because first of all, I mean, this goes back to the way that you guys play with the semantics of the word socialism, depending on like, okay, as soon as we're losing the debate, then we say, well, that's not socialism.
So then maybe we can find a little overlap in our definitions of socialism, because I still don't think I have a concrete definition from you of what technically qualifies a country as a socialist country. But I would say that if we're talking about nationalizing a key sector of the economy, that's a socialist action, right?
At the point at which it's taken for granted that the quote unquote means of production will be nationalized, right? And then even when you say like Venezuela's free marketplace, most of what's left in the quote unquote free marketplace in Venezuela, because of the successive effects of industrial nationalization, has left that the only free marketplace is a loose black market where goods are produced across the border and smuggled in by smugglers who are selling toilet paper, the shittiest Hole Ripper Plus one ply fiberglass toilet paper for like $25 a fucking roll.
The whole reason,
and that's not real capitalism, right?
So the whole reason that I'm digging in on this is because I'm trying to get a bright line, because you're the one who first came out and said that like, oh, all these people that say this is socialism and all these countries that claim they're socialism, all the ones that work aren't actual socialism. The only ones that are socialism are the ones that I pick out. So tell me how a country, if it's not North Korea, that doesn't even need currency, they just need vouchers because every single thing in their economy is nationalized. If that's socialism, okay, fine. Tell me what the threshold is for a country that has a mixed marketplace of nationalized industries and not nationalized industries. What's the one that meets the threshold of socialism? Because I'm not trying to be rude, but it seems to me like you're defining socialism as countries that use socialist policies that fail, but you're intentionally excluding countries that use socialist policies that self-identify as socialist but succeed.
So first of all, it's overall government ownership of the economy, which the overall government ownership of the economy in Norway is very low, despite you claiming that it's socialist. Like the overall government ownership of the economy is, out of any country that any socialist would define as is socialist, if you were to throw Norway and Sweden into that, they would own the smallest percentage out of that compared to countries like Venezuela and Cuba. If in the actual economy, the only food you can find comes from the state and the only medicine that you can find comes from the state, socialist. Like even as much as I attacked the socialist invasions into Canada's healthcare program, they still have way more private marketplace in Canada's healthcare program than Venezuela has in their food.
I think that it's all about this socialist boogeyman. I'm more than happy to be like, Venezuela's economic model clearly didn't work. Like, duh. Norway's economic model clearly does work. The United States economic model is currently working, but it's working on borrowed money. And if something doesn't change, it's going to eventually completely fail. There's all kinds of shit that we can say about these different economic models. My whole argument is that to put it into a binary of a capitalist system versus a socialist system is silly, right? We're talking about countries that have their own models, and those models are frequently changing, right?
The more that you have total government control versus the government taking an authoritarian step in and then making more decisions, right? It's shades of gray. And so we agree that there's at least shades of gray here, right?
So yeah, I mean, I agree that every single system is different. The thing I'm digging in on is it's silly to say this country qualifies as socialism, this country doesn't.
No, it's not. It's not like when you're talking about the government owning more than half the economy.
And that's a brand new arbitrary definition you've just created.
As I said this earlier, and this is an important point that you didn't take into account when I'm talking about like how much of a percentage of the economy does the government own?
We can certainly start to agree at the sense that Venezuela did not diversify its production portfolio.
Mm-hmm. You're right about the diversity of the Venezuelan economy. There are socialist economies that have at least managed diversity of economy better, like say China.
Right. I think China and Norway, whether to the extent that you agree that they're socialism, I think is more of a semantic distinction. But I think that China and Norway are both good examples of countries who are very intentional about the choices they make in terms of how they work their economy and make it work in the global marketplace.
Right.
Whether they're socialist fucking utopias or socialist hellholes or whatever, however you frame it, they're both socialist countries that obviously the proof is in the pudding. They're not failing right now.
And that's why, even though I want to give you a credit and say there are socialist economies that can manage to be more diversified than Venezuela, they're still unsustainable and headed for huge crashes based off of enormous bubbles, based off of the idea that a government can direct economy better than people making their own decisions in a free marketplace. Every society that has worked has been based off of letting individual free actors in a free marketplace make their own decisions about what's sustainable. And the failed economies are the planned economies. Like every scheme that you guys have said, well, this scheme could work. Like we can point to a time in the recent 20 to 50, 100 year history where you guys, well, this scheme is working, it's going well, and then it fails, right? And like you can only point to the ones that haven't failed yet, that are just unique little variations and twists on the last version of the failed scheme. Whereas like the only thing that's been shown to work is a free market.
So I have to say that I think you're part of a cult.
Oh, I'm the cult member.
I do because here's the thing, and I have the benefit of being the person who doesn't have to pick a side, but you don't have that same benefit. Like when someone says, I hold in one hand capitalism, free market, unregulated capitalism, and in the other hand, I hold communism, state-controlled, no currency, communism. I don't have to pick one, but you do, because you are in the cult of capitalism. I get to say, what are all the countries out there? Who's doing what and what's working?
No, see, that's where you're wrong, Mike, because when you look at all the countries that are out there and who's doing what and what's working, the countries that say that they're capitalist and the countries that have practiced a version of existing capitalism have always done better. And the countries that define themselves as socialist and have been, objectively identified as socialists are the ones that are doing worse. And so it's
with
not
the exclusion of all Nordic countries.
But they're three small, like when you talk about the populations of those Nordic countries, like 3 or 4 small Nordic countries. Let's do a thought experiment and say how many countries have defined themselves as socialist in the last 100 years. And the only ones that would ever and use that label, and it's completely debatable whether or not that label actually applies, are the Nordic countries. The overwhelming majority of the countries that would, if they agree that they've tried socialism, then it's a failure. If it's debatable about whether or not they've tried socialism, then maybe you get more success debatably for socialism, because again, it's always debatable about whether or not these Nordic countries are socialists.
As long as you live in the U.S., you can debate whether they're socialist.
No, even the people there would debate about it. Like
No,
there's no consent. Like that's not true, because like especially
no, I know it is true. Norwegians know that they live in a democratic socialist country.
Okay, and that's where you use and that's why like all leftists are inherently dishonest, because we were talking about socialism versus quote unquote democratic socialism, which is another definition of socialism that you have jumped around to.
No, Norwegians, if you say yes or no, is Norway socialist? They say yes, definitely.
Only in the broadest sense. But then if you get into debates about what socialism means, right? And this is like why
semantic.
No. This is why, because the only time that you stick to concrete definitions, you find out that it doesn't work, and the left runs away from the definition. And anytime the left sticks to a definition and you can say that a socialist country works, you can prove that countries like Norway and Venezuela are different, right? Because like, Norway did, and this goes back to your thing, did Norway nationalize the food production industry? Did they? Did they start running out private industry for food production because they wanted to help the poor?
Yeah, that's your new arbitrary metric for what qualifies as socialism that you made up in the last 20 minutes.
This is stuff you guys on the left, when we were city college students, were saying, oh, it's so woke how they're giving the food to the poor.
You've just
he
taken
must
a
be so
massive
beautifully
tangent
woke.
off of whether Norway has socialized the food system, by the way.
And they haven't, which is a point that you've consistently...
You have to go to a government store if you want to buy alcohol in Norway.
That's alcohol, even in states like...
So you don't think it's a socialist policy that you have to go to a government store to buy alcohol in Norway?
It's a trash policy.
Cheers. All right. So one thing that I want to hammer in, whether I agree with you or not, Kurt, is that you referred to Norway as a capitalist state with a heavy welfare system. So when a candidate like Bernie Sanders says that we want to model the U.S. economy after a country like a Scandinavian country like Norway, it sounds like you're ready to commit to not call him a socialist.
And this goes back to the fact that you guys won't consistently stick to definitions, because it's being a socialist means being dishonest.
I'm not a socialist.
Right, depending on what day of the week it is, fucking Mike. The point is that... Because I'm definitely sure I have a recording or at least something somewhere where Mike defines himself as a socialist. And my point is that you guys will not consistently stick to the definition of socialism versus democratic socialism
because there's no definition of it.
Right. And thank you. Right. It's just it's just about which asshole can I sell this shit out of. And the point being,
Well, I'm glad we can agree that there's no objective definition of socialism,
and that
there's no objective definition of capitalism,
and that
right?
and that every variation of socialism is again a different dribble of shit out of a different asshole. Unless
it's the United States Social Security system or Medicare.
Well, that's a blowhole of a beautiful blue whale.
It's so funny that we get off on these tangents because the truth is like once we return to normalcy and get a moment to like take a deep breath, Kurt and I both realized that, like, for example, in the United States, I mean, I don't know if Kurt will call all these things socialist, but the U.S. has tons of socialized policies and tons of redistribution of wealth policies. I mean, a penny of taxes is a penny of redistribution of wealth. And I'm pretty sure Kurt's not a free market fucking anarchist. Right, like he believes in programs.
I agree that we do have social welfare programs, and as I've said before, and I'll say again, one of the things that makes me definitely a Republican and definitely not a libertarian is that I do believe in programs like Social Security. I really believe in them.
Yeah. So when Kurt's very critical,
and I believe in certain aspects of Medicare, but not Medicare for all. Right.
Yeah, you believe in all that shit. UBI, you're all about it.
No.
Andrew Yang, 2020. That's Kurt. That's who Kurt's writing in on the ballot.
I think you thought you could sneak that past me, making me think that I was endorsing UTIs, urinary tract infections, which I do support.
We can start to maybe agree when we say that whether Venezuela is an example of failed socialism or not, which is clearly something we're going to have to leave on the table for this week, whether or not they are an example of failed socialism, that Venezuela definitely made a fuck stupid when they didn't diversify their economic portfolio in terms of production.
And then even if you want to pursue the socialist option and say that the socialist option works, at least clearly the Chinese model has proven you got to diversify your shit, brother. Yeah. If you want to say that it's a Ponzi scheme or it's a sustainable scheme, the scheme only works if you diversify.
Yeah. Just like your 401k, you got to diversify that shit.
I'll drink to that.
Sorry, Maduro, you got to try to cash Chavez's check.
But it was in the old currency, which is no longer on.
It was the old bolivars.
Yeah.
That 2 million bolivar check is not worth nearly as much as it used to. Doesn't go quite as far.
Are you ready to move on to common grounds?
I am, yeah.
What do we agree on in this that I think should stand out and we should leave people with?
Well, when it comes to Venezuela, anybody that is critical of Nicolas Maduro is either intentionally or unintentionally stumbling upon the correct perspective because the guy is a dictator. I don't have such an unfavorable perspective on Chavez. I think that he shot himself and his country in the foot by undermining democracy throughout his terms as president, although based on what I know of him, I do believe that he was a champion of the people, right or wrong. But that being said, I think that it would be interesting to see this crisis play out if Chavez was still president. What would be different? What would Chavez do differently from Maduro? Or did Chavez set the situation up where I will never say that anyone conveniently dies, but he left politics at a time that was very convenient for him, right? Because up until the point that he passed away, oil had been booming. And so all of his distributions of wealth, no one had ever come to collect on anything. It didn't matter nearly as much that Venezuela wasn't producing food because up until Chavez's death, Venezuela could still afford to buy all the food they needed.
It's the time period in which the chickens come home to roost is a psychological thing. We've seen over and over again where a Republican pays for things that happened under a Democrat and vice versa. A Democrat pays for things that happened under a Republican. And that's the truth about politics here in the United States. And it happens in vice versa, and in straightforward in international politics too. Yeah. So all this goes to show why the idea of pure communism, pure socialism, pure capitalism is all a trash idea anyway.
Here.
Because it's all predicated on being overly ideological rather than being overly practical based on the realities of the economy and the society and the world that you live in.
You know what? I agree with that. Cheers.
Cheers.
So thanks for listening.
We hope that you share, comment, and like us on social media.
Yeah.
On social media, I am Right Brain Kurt on everything on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter.
That's right. I'm Left Brain Mike on all of those things, except for Twitter, where I'm Mike Left Brain. And the show itself is an entity. Shows are people too, in the words of Mitt Romney.
Yes.
That's RBLB Pod on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon.
That's right.
So until next week,
Don't stick your dick in the electrical socket, even if you find one on the BART train and it's hidden under a seat and you're super excited.
I don't get really intense about size, but whose dick fits in electrical sockets?
It's not that anyone's dick fits, but then you just look at it and you're like, how much can I get?
Don't ride a motorcycle over 1,000 cc's without an endorsement. Under 1,000 cc's, you're fine.
Don't switch your wallet from your back pocket to your jacket pocket and then just get up when you're transferring trains on a morning where you're hungover anyway and assume that the wallet didn't fall out of the jacket pocket, because as it turns out, as of Monday, that's exactly what happened to me, Right Brain Kurt.
It's all right. It only had $1 in it.
It only had one single dollar. But it had 3 different bank cards linked to accounts that also had only $1.
I'm Left Brain Mike.
And I'm Right Brain Kurt.
We'll see you next week. Right Brain Left Brain is Mike Epley and Kurt Wagner.
The show is produced by Nick Bernardi.
Graphics are by Bianca Crampton.
And the Right Brain Left Brain theme is by Disonar.
Disonor. Dysonor. It's like
Dysonor.
dinosaur, but the S and the N are whatever. Find them on Spotify. They're awesome. See you next week.
He's a talented musician who is the autistic son of a dinosaur.